What's going on, guys? We are here with Nick Tumminello, and he's just finished presenting at the Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference. Nick, tell the guys what your presentation was about. What was the overall gist?
Well, it's called Better Back Rows, and it basically talks about how to use physiological and biomechanical factors to choose exercises and the weights you're using for traditional horizontal pulling exercises, whether it be with a machine, dumbbell, barbell, cable rows, seated cable rows, whatever, and how to use those biomechanical factors to your advantage, and how a lot of people don't understand them, and how they tend to kind of hinder how you perform rows, even when you think you're doing rows properly.
Yeah. So what are some of the common mistakes that people make with performing their rows?
I would just say you're choosing your weight based on kind of how it feels in that initial third of the pull, right? And the problem is, most of the time, even people who are really considered about their form, when they get all the way to the top of that row, or the shortened range, you see that little head, or if it's a single arm, they tend to turn a little bit, even if it's just a little bit, or if they're doing a seated row, they'll sit back a bit, or if they're doing a single arm seated, they'll sit back and they'll turn. Or the opposite, if you're super form, you're like, hey, if I don't do that, and you're all the way up here, well, the problem is, this is where you don't have a mechanical advantage. But when you have a mechanical advantage down here, now you're not really optimally strengthening through here, because the weight is only challenging you all the way up here when you have the least mechanical advantage. So basically the takeaway, without giving the whole presentation, is that
you got to come next time.
Not in developing what I call full range strength. Doesn't necessarily come from doing what we would think of as full range of motion exercises. Now, when I say range of motion, I mean relative to a certain exercise, not the joint is capable of, just for the people who are very nuanced and oriented out there.
Cross your T's, dot your I's. Yeah, awesome. And I guess one of the other things that you spoke about that I really liked was not just choosing exercises, but the prescription of exercises more so relates to the decision-making process behind that, as opposed to the exercise and the movement itself. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, you pretty much summed it up, but really what determines, so let's say this. Most trainers and strength coaches out there will say, oh, well, there's good trainers and bad trainers. There's good doctors and bad doctors. Interestingly, they never put themselves on the wrong side of that equation, right? Yeah. But we rarely have standards in regards to what we mean by that, and normally the standards that we judge by are highly biased. We're all biased, you and I are biased, but they're biased towards whatever we feel is the best way to train. Yeah. So if you're really into powerlifting and you don't see someone really emphasizing the 3 big lifts, you'll probably think they're not a good trainer. But that's what I mean by bias. That's just one way to train, right? That's not what I'm talking about. The standards of which that I use are the decision-making process of how a true expert knows how to organize, analyze, and prioritize exercises better than the everyday trainer. The everyday trainer knows lots of exercises, variations, and they know how to coach them really well. But when it comes to understanding when to rule out certain exercises and how to order and how to apply and how to deal with range of motion and things, when you get beyond the coaching aspect, by the way, we're talking about the technical aspects, not the behavioral and not the emotional and the personal aspect.
That's optimal.
Correct. That's all a different conversation. Purely the technical aspects right now. That's what really separates a lot of trainers. And unfortunately, you don't get that from purely reading articles and purely the YouTube and magazines. You really have to analyze things and not consider not consider who I learned it from. Oh, I learned it from Jacob. Jacob's got great biceps, so it must be true. That's not analyzing. That's memorizing.
Yeah, right. You don't want to be a parrot regurgitating information you don't understand, right? Correct.
And when you can do that, what I say, it's like you want to be like Neo when he went into the Matrix, and he went from seeing humans to seeing ones and zeros. Yeah. And when you can do that, when you can analyze exercises, you're never confused by conflicting information, because you filter right through all that and you look at the principles behind it, and you see whether it's standing on shaky ground or not.
The principles underlying the method is always where coaches should be finding themselves. There's something that you started getting into, which I found extremely interesting, and it's sort of been like a theme of the discussion behind the scenes at the UABC is, critical thinking, skepticism, and things like this. And I really like the way that you think, and obviously break down and pull apart certain arguments. It's quite rational, logical, you know, and you do eliminate a lot of emotion, which I think is really useful. And something that you brought up was the steelman argument. Do you want to explain what this is and why this is something that coaches should be aware of?
Sure. Well, first off, I don't get credit for coming up with this concept. I've heard it around. It's fairly new to me, and I've only heard it fairly recently in these skeptical circles.
Yeah.
And I would say, by the way, I consider myself a keyword constructive skeptic. Most people, skeptics, are kind of think destructive. You're only saying no. You're only saying don't do that, don't do that. But that's not very helpful. People say, well, what do I do instead? So, constructive skeptic. Okay. What a steelman is, it's the opposite of a straw man. Yep. And actually, just a quick sidebar, another thing I learned at a skeptics conference years ago was a guy called it a red straw herring man, which is because a lot of times people will combine the straw man with the red herring.
Yeah.
And so they call it the red straw herring man. All right, so that one's kind of obvious. So a steelman is basically this. If you find someone that you disagree with on a certain premise or a certain conclusion, maybe you agree on the premise but you disagree on the conclusion from the premise. So let's say you and I are having a debate, and if I were to steelman you, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I should be able to repeat your argument to you just as well as you can where you say yes. And the second component is if I actually feel that there is a stronger way to make your argument, I will then do that. Well, I would say, well, in fact, even if you said this, we could do this, that, and the other, and you go, would you agree? Yeah, right? So before I take it down, I'm going to make it as strong as possible, hence the steelman, and then I'll take it down. Because otherwise, instead, I'm kind of arguing my own straw man.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. I want to make your argument as strong as possible.
And I think that's a really useful skill as a coach, is to be able to argue two extreme ends of any fitness topic equally as well, and to know them as well, as opposed to just knowing one side of the argument. You know, for example, we use keto. You know, you should be able to support keto as well as break it down and show that, hey, maybe it's not you know, as effective or necessary as possible, because I think that allows you to better apply a certain principle or concept in any given context. Because as you and I know, the fitness industry swings back and forth in opinions, and I think this is a really useful way to think about things. Yeah, well, I'd like to say a couple things about this. One is the steelmanning is important because it stops the I didn't say that. That's not what I meant. And that is very annoying. And that's a quick way to erode a conversation and have it circle the drain fast, right? So we have a tendency to want to react before we respond. So before you respond to anybody here, especially if you're in a disagreement, you want to be able to repeat back to them. Okay, so before I reply, let me make sure I'm not misrepresenting your point. That's one of my favorite things to say. Are you saying that A is connected to B and therefore C? Yes. Okay. Then you proceed to move forward, because what you've done is you put them in a corner and they basically said, you are not misinterpreting me right now. That's one thing, and that way you don't have to go to this back and forth, you know, oh, that's not what I said, and I didn't say this kind of thing. And then and that way you're also showing that you're listening to them, because a lot of times we're not actually listening. No, we're too busy constructing our own arguments before giving them a chance to speak their truth. Well, guys, that's Nick Tumminello. I think he's a fantastic presenter. He blew my socks off. I think he blew everybody's socks off, and he's very knowledgeable. So if you're not following him, make sure you do. Check him out, Nick Tumminello, on Instagram. Performance as well. Performance U, yeah. PerformanceU.com, is it .com? Yeah, or my name, Nick Tumminello, which is far harder to spell. Have you got two? You got the two websites. It's the same. It takes you to the same spot. Cool. There you go. I wasn't aware of that. Awesome, guys. Make sure you follow Nick. And any questions, feel free to comment below, because I'm sure Nick will answer them for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you, man. Thank you for the compliments too. No.